Hello, welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled Increasing Diversity in Clinical Trials, FDA Guidance, and Industry Efforts. I'm Zahal Reed, Senior Attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenters, Ronni Fuchs and Kyle Dolinsky, thank you for joining us. Ronni is a partner at Troutman Pepper. She focuses her practice on pharmaceutical and medical device litigation and advises on clinical trial issues, including informed consent, clinical trial injuries, recruitment, and payment issues. Kyle is an associate at Troutman Pepper. Kyle focuses his practice on advising life sciences and healthcare clients on FDA regulatory and fraud and abuse issues, as well as pharmaceutical and medical device litigation. And with that, I will turn things over to Ronni.
Thank you, Zahal. So thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to our webinar on increasing diversity in clinical trials, which is both an important and a timely topic. I'm going to take myself off screen and just show you our slides as we go forward. So today we're going to cover some topics regarding clinical trials, including the latest FDA draft guidance regarding submission of a diversity plan for clinical trials, which is still in draft form, having been issued in April of this year. Obstacles to diversity in clinical trials, recent efforts by industry, and recommendations from industry groups, and the FDA to improve diversity in clinical trials.
Ronni, can you talk a little bit about why it matters that clinical trials be diverse?
Sure. So at a very high level, when some groups are underrepresented in clinical trials, there's a risk of collecting insufficient data to assess their effectiveness or safety in those populations. As well, racial and ethnic background in combination with interdependent factors like social determinants and genetics can contribute to differences in responses to diagnostics or treatments. Clinical trial research contributes to scientific knowledge for treatment options that may potentially benefit patients and the broader scientific community in the future, and equitable access to clinical trials is really integral to achieving health equity.
Can you give us some examples of where unrecognized differences between populations can present risks?
Yeah, sure. There's actually a very recent example from the COVID-19 crisis where racial bias in pulse oximetry measurement became a very big issue. So there have been a number of publications on this issue. I pulled this one from the New England Journal of Medicine, which focuses on the fact that pulse oximetry became such an important tool during the COVID crisis, was being used to triage patients as well as to determine treatment. And during that crisis, people noticed and raised questions about whether pulse oximeter technology, which the original development was studied in mostly white population, raised issues about whether pulse oximeters were accurately reading darker pigmented people's oxygen levels. And pulse oximeters largely, or at least in part, rely on the coloration of your skin to take a reading. In some studies that were done during COVID, Black patients had nearly 3 times the frequency of hidden hypoxemia that was not being detected by pulse oximetry as white patients. And in this particular correspondence to the New England Journal of Medicine, the authors state that relying on pulse oximetry to triage patients and to adjust supplemental oxygen levels may be placing Black patients at increased risk. So in recognition of this, the FDA has recently set an advisory committee meeting to address what to do about pulse oximeters in individuals with darker skin pigmentation. And this meeting is going to take place next week on November 1st. So that's both a real life example and a very recent example.
And are there examples on the drug side as well?
Yeah, so there's a good example from research that was done with ARBs, which are used to lower blood pressure. So in one study, there was an intentional commitment and an effort to enroll more Black patients in a phase 3 clinical trial of a monotherapy of a particular ARB. And the reason they wanted to enroll more Black patients was that Black populations are known to more commonly have low levels of renin, an enzyme that aids in controlling sodium. In addition, Black people in the United States have earlier onset high blood pressure, increased severity, and increased comorbidities. So in that study, monotherapy was less effective in Black subjects, which led it to contain a label warning treaters about this fact. But then it also led to a study of combination therapy specifically designed to address low renin. So this was a combination therapy of the same product, but in combination with a specifically selected diuretic. And the combination therapy resulted in an equalizing effect. So the combination had similar efficacy between both Black and non-Black patients, which was then added to the label. So you see how in both of these instances, there were real differences in populations who were treated with either a device or a drug that were or would have been missed if you were not concerning yourself with diversity in clinical trials. Kyle, what has the FDA said about the importance of diverse patient data?
So in 2017, in addressing medical device clinical trials, the FDA said that US population demographic changes and diverse representation in clinical trials remains a challenge. And specifically, inconsistent analysis and reporting contributes to a persistent lack of publicly available data on device performance in diverse ethnic and racial groups. And the FDA goes on to say that there are several devices where differences in effects were observed that were correlated with race and ethnicity, and they give some additional examples.
So has the FDA addressed issues of diversity in clinical trials before the latest guidance?
Yes, so this actually goes back quite a while. Back in 1997, the FDA Modernization Act directed the FDA to develop guidance on the inclusion of women and minorities in clinical trials. And fast forward to 2010, the FDA established an Office of Minority Health with the goal of reducing health disparities among racial and ethnic minorities. Then a couple years later, in 2012, the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, or FDASIA, directed the FDA to examine racial and ethnic subgroup data in new product applications and publish its findings. And in 2014, the FDA did so in an action plan. What they found there was that the demographic data on race and ethnicity was incompletely reported and inconsistently reported. So for example, maybe one study reported as white or non-white, while another study might break non-white into other categories. So you couldn't really get a consistent snapshot across trials. So the FDA took a step back to address how we were collecting that data. Ronni, can you tell us what the FDA snapshots are?
Sure. So as you were saying, as part of FDASIA, the FDA was supposed to report on the diversity of participants in clinical trials. And in 2015, CDER piloted an effort that was called the Drug Trial Snapshots, in which it published a snapshot for every novel drug that was approved within a month of the approval date. And that snapshot provided a report of the demographic breakdown. Then at the end of the year, CDER published a summary report, which provided an overall average of the demographic groups, followed by a more detailed summary. So at the end of the day, you could wind up with the information broken down for each newly approved drug, as well as the summary data at the end of the year. And on this slide, I put the 2015 summary, which was the first one, followed by the 2020 summary. And what you note is that the categories are different. So in 2015, it was women, African American, Asian, white, other, and in 2020, it was white, Black or African American, Asian, Hispanic. So they changed the way things were being reported. And Kyle, can you tell us how that happened?
Sure. So in 2016, the FDA put out a guidance, and they followed that up in 2017 with guidance specifically directed to medical device companies. And that's the 2017 guidance that I was mentioning just a couple minutes ago. Those two guidances together instruct on how to collect data on race and ethnicity in clinical trials. The FDA adopted the OMB's classifications so that the racial and ethnic groups are grouped into categories the same way that you would see, for example, in census data. Then in 2020, the FDA issued a guidance on enhancing diversity in clinical trials with some suggestions, including changes to eligibility criteria, enrollment practices, and clinical trial designs, which we'll address a little bit later.
Okay, so that takes us up to the FDA's April 2022 draft guidance regarding diversity plans. What does that guidance add to the existing body of guidances?
So the previous guidances had mentioned the need for sponsors to have what was called a diversity plan, but they hadn't really specified what that was supposed to look like. And this draft guidance provides recommendations to companies that are conducting clinical trials as to how to create that race and ethnicity diversity plan to focus on enrolling representative members of participants from underrepresented racial and ethnic populations in the US. It does not address diversity with respect to age, pregnancy, gender, or disability, but many of those categories are largely addressed elsewhere. The draft guidance recommends that companies submit a diversity plan for products that require an IND for drugs or biologics, or an IDE for devices, or for which clinical trials are intended to support marketing submissions. The guidance suggests submitting the diversity plans early on in the development process for drugs, no later than when a sponsor is seeking feedback for applicable pivotal trials, which would usually take place at the end of a phase 2 meeting. And for devices, they suggest that this be done as part of an investigational plan included in the IDE application. In addition, the draft guidance says that the diversity plan should be included in the marketing application, along with an update on successes and challenges of implementing the plan. Ronni, do you want to start off with what has to be contained in the diversity plan?
Sure. So the diversity plan has 5 elements. It contains an overview of the disease or condition, the scope of the medical development program, the goals that the sponsor has for enrolling underrepresented racial and ethnic participants, a specific plan of action to do so, and to retain those participants, and finally, an updated status of meeting enrollment goals as applicable. And we'll explain a little bit more of that as we go along.
So can you take us through those different pieces of the plan?
Sure. So in the first instance, you have to present an overview of the disease or condition. And in that overview, FDA wants you to describe the available data on the pathophysiology of the disease or condition in underrepresented racial and ethnic populations, and any disparity in the application of currently available prevention, screening, or diagnostic or treatment strategies across racial and ethnic populations, and to discuss the current evidence supporting similarities or differences in the disease or the condition associated with underrepresented racial and ethnic populations in the US.
So the low renin example that you described before sounds like a good example of differences in the disease or condition associated with underrepresented racial and ethnic populations. Are there other examples?
Yeah, there are a number of examples that actually represent the disparities in treatment. So, for example, minority young adults currently represent the largest growing population with type 1 diabetes and tend to experience very poor outcomes. Black and Hispanic young adults, with type 1 diabetes are 2 to 3 times less likely to use medical technology to treat the disease compared with white Americans. And there are also significant glycemic disparities. In cardiovascular care, up to 1.5 million Americans suffer from aortic stenosis, a narrowing of the aortic valve opening that restricts blood flow in the heart. And TAVR therapy is a minimally invasive procedure to replace the aortic valve that is, fairly recent. But research shows that patients of color are offered TAVR at significantly lower rates than white patients. So those would be examples of treatment disparities that should be discussed in section 1 of the plan. And then moving on to the second part of the plan, the scope of the development program. So this is where FDA wants you to describe the planned trials to support product safety and effectiveness. And as part of this, they want you to explain the study design, the population, the endpoints, the expected geographic locations, and how those geographic locations may or may not address the inclusion of underrepresented populations, as well as any applicable differential findings from clinical pharmacology studies associated with particular racial or ethnic populations. And then the third part is the goals of enrollment. So you are meant to define and justify your planned enrollment of participants from underrepresented racial and ethnic populations. So you have to specify in this section the underrepresented populations that have this disease or perhaps are overburdened on a population basis by the disease, which is based on your assessment in section 1, and specify your goals for enrollment of underrepresented populations based on any information that would impact the outcomes. You also have to provide an assessment as to whether you believe you will need to enroll a greater than proportional number of underrepresented people in order to have enough data and be sensitive enough to identify important differences among the populations. And then you have to create your plan of action, and your plan of action is really your operational plan. What are you going to do in order to effectively enroll people? They want you to explain your site locations, access to your site. What are you doing by way of sustained community engagement to enroll people from underrepresented populations? How you plan to reduce burdens due to clinical trial design. Here you can describe your thinking on things like reducing the number of study-related visits and procedures. The possibility that you might use a local laboratory or local imaging capabilities rather than have people come to a central clinical location. possibility of using telehealth or virtual visits to cut down on the burden on clinical trial participants. And then they want you to describe the metrics that you're going to use along the way to ensure that your enrollment goals are being achieved and what you're planning to do if you're not meeting those goals along the way. And then finally, to the extent that you've already begun the trial, or as Kyle noted, you're meant to submit this plan on multiple occasions, not just before the trial, but also in your marketing application. So at that point, you should be updating the current status of meeting your goals, and if needed, maybe a justification for how you're going to collect the data in a post-marketing study, because perhaps you have not been able to meet the goals that you set for yourself.
Ronni, do you have a sense of the most burdensome aspect of the plan?
Yeah, if you assume that the information about the disease or condition is that is section 1 is already available to you. That is, you're not treating an orphan disease, and you are not just developing that information. And that the company has engaged in goal setting, has already thought about those issues. Then really the hardest part, and where the rubber hits the road, is how are you going to achieve those goals? And in thinking about how you're going to achieve your goals, it's important to consider the obstacles that are preventing you from achieving those goals. Kyle, can you share some of the obstacles to increasing diversity in clinical trials?
Well, there are a lot of obstacles to diversity in clinical trials. First, there's a history of mistrust in certain minority populations of participating and being subjects in research. And that understandably arises in part out of experiences like the Tuskegee syphilis study and the exploitation of Henrietta Lacks in the cultivating of the HeLa cell line without her consent. There's also issues of access, where it's been suggested that clinical trials have not been run in places where there are a lot of minority participants, so site selection issues. There are burdens of having to go out to clinical trial sites frequently, taking time off from work, taking time away from childcare and elder care, and other responsibilities which have had a disproportionate burden on some socioeconomic groups. And then eligibility criteria has also been cited as an issue.
Can you explain how eligibility criteria is an obstacle to diversity?
Sure. So as an example, the Black community is disproportionately burdened by diabetes, but eligibility criteria in diabetes trials often tries to exclude people who have comorbidities. And the issue is that Black Americans with diabetes are disproportionately affected by comorbidities. So the question is whether that really needs to be an exclusion criteria, because if you do that and comorbidities are disproportionately present in the Black community, then you're cutting down your population that could even be eligible to enroll. So there has to be attention given to the exclusion criteria as an obstacle, and it's something that needs to be examined further. And then turning back to our other obstacles, there's also the issue of bias, that patients from some underrepresented groups might even be steered away from participation in the clinical trials. So in light of these significant obstacles, Ronni, what are some of the efforts that are being made by the industry? And let's start with the device industry.
Yeah, sure. So in 2020, AdvaMed issued 4 principles on health equity to promote inclusion and equity in healthcare and research in the MedTech industry. And principle number 4 is promoting research equity in MedTech. And AdvaMed discusses accounting for historic distrust on the part of some populations due to racially biased treatment in the past, that work should be reflective of the need for an innovative approach to recruit and monitor subjects using primary care providers, the use of telehealth and digital medicine. And I just want to point out that some of these things you will note are going to repeat as they begin to be understood on a broader basis, and really the flip side of it is best practices are beginning to be elucidated to address some of these things. And then in 2022, AdvaMed partnered with Meharry Medical College and HBCU in Nashville on a workshop series to focus on increasing diversity in clinical trials. And Kyle, on the drug side of the world with pharma, have there also been efforts along these same lines?
There have, and they've come up with similar guidelines. So PhRMA, which is the trade group for the pharmaceutical and biologics industries, came out with principles to enhance diversity and clinical trial participation in 2020. And they said that by committing to enhancing diversity in clinical trial populations, we can better reflect the patients that will use the new therapy or medicine being studied and solve for improved health outcomes. For example, different populations may be at higher risk for certain diseases, such as sickle cell disease, diabetes, or heart disease. Clinical trials for the development of new medicines for those diseases should aim to reflect the patient population they are aiming to help. Ultimately, diverse clinical trials support a better understanding of the medicine. Then in 2022, PhRMA announced a new community-based initiative to enhance clinical trial diversity. This is the first in-kind effort to build trust and address systemic barriers by adding community-based trial sites. These community-based trial sites will, among other things, partner with trusted messengers and community leaders to raise education, awareness, and support for clinical trial participation, provide resources and technical support for local sites to be successful and sustainable long-term, build training opportunities and mentorship for investigators and staff, and create a comprehensive collaborative network of sustainable, connected, community-based sites supporting clinical trial diversity in underserved communities. The goal is to support the equitable breakthrough in medicine development with the Yale School of Medicine, the Morehouse School of Medicine, and Vanderbilt University Medical Center.
And what is the FDA saying about steps that that sponsors can take to improve diversity in clinical trials?
The April 2022 draft guidance mentions some steps that sponsors can take, and those include reimbursement for expenses incurred for travel or lodging, creating clinical trial documents in other languages so that you can serve diverse populations, and partnering with community-based organizations to provide support to study or trial participants. But the industry has addressed these recommendations at a much more granular and operational level. Ronni, can you tell us what AdvaMed is saying?
Yeah, sure. And I think that it's definitely true that the industry has gotten a lot more granular in its addressing these recommendations. So AdvaMed says, first, we need to be aware of historical biases that exist in clinical research and potential mistrust of the healthcare system by underrepresented populations. And we need to have intentional conversations with company leadership and various stakeholders to highlight the potential impact of the lack of diversity in clinical trials. That we need to develop goals to broaden evidence generation efforts to include a more diverse patient population in clinical research and also be able to measure our own progress. That we should use a variety of tools to adequately define the targeted population, including leveraging real-world data sources. That we need to create a sustainable community of researchers and partner with more community-based clinicians. We need to coordinate with clinical investigators to make sure that they inform other local clinicians of opportunities to support diverse enrollment. We need to be prepared to go to the patient by broadening the types and locations of clinical trial sites and the diversity of investigators, and understand the importance of building trust in recruiting diverse participants. And then perhaps even more granularly, AdvaMed says we need to identify the aspects of study design, inclusion and exclusion criteria, the follow-up visit requirements that might be undermining efforts to increase or hold on to diverse participation. That we need to offer more direct and clear communication about the importance of diversity with the PIs in our studies. That we need to support sites with the development of culturally and linguistically appropriate outreach, study information, and materials. We need to consider additional and alternative sites if the current sites are not well suited to recruit or retain diverse participants, including considering trial sites closer to minority patient communities. And address logistical challenges like limited office hours and limited locations that might lead to the loss of patients to follow up, including things like considering remote visits or the use of visiting nurses or remote sites. Kyle, has PhRMA said any of these similar things?
Yes, they have. PhRMA's taken a similar approach, and they've recommended establishing policies or practices specifically focused on enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations. And they also urge manufacturers to consider making those policies and practices publicly available. They also recommend enhancing education and increasing clinical trial awareness through community outreach, identifying sites where diverse patients with a particular disease or condition are located, collaborating with investigators to address the goals of enrolling a diverse population, so involving patients and patient advocates and caregivers from underrepresented groups in the trial design process, considering recruitment challenges and enrollment barriers, which include planned visit schedules, location, financial implications, and how those factors might be addressed through flexible scheduling and utilizing digital technologies. For example, mobile tools and wearable technologies, which help gather data from participants in a decentralized or virtual means for decentralized and virtual trials. PhRMA also urges that, that manufacturers consider the incidence, prevalence, and severity of the condition or disease in various populations, as well as other prognostic factors that might influence the response to any intervention or outcome variable. Using information on the populations at risk for a particular disease to enhance understanding of the heterogeneity of treatment effect or lack thereof, and for selected subgroups to broaden the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And finally, to continue gathering data on how a treatment or preventative measure works in certain diverse populations after a medical product is approved.
And so all of these operational suggestions are really nicely captured in this chart from the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard. And you'll note that they reflect a lot of the things that that we've already spoken about, and I think they do so in sort of a nice form. So sort of starting in the lower left, incorporating diverse patient imagery into trial awareness material, ensuring sites are in diverse locations where we're putting the sites in the right places, utilizing diverse traditional and social media outlets and incorporating community engagement. Assessing before the protocol is finalized, both the screening and eligibility criteria to ensure we're not being unduly restrictive. considering multilingual translations of our trial materials, incorporating decentralized or hybrid trial options to reduce the travel burden and the visit burden, and analyze the data at the end of the day by subpopulation, including subpopulations most impacted by the disease. And so, I think this is a really nice summary of where FDA, AdvaMed, PhRMA, and clinical trial study groups are beginning to focus and settle on what we can do in the near term. You know, as Kyle and I were talking about these issues, we both had really different thoughts about how all of this fits into the bigger picture relating to clinical trials generally. And I thought I would tell you my big picture thoughts, what came to my mind about all of this, and then ask Kyle to give you his. So I thought about how these issues relate to other corporate goals, including DEI, transparency, and ESG efforts. And I pulled out some information from a couple of companies here, but this is just a very small example. I think you could find an enormous amount of work being done on these issues, and the clinical trial issue being incorporated into a lot of other efforts. But for example, Medtronic's annual diversity, equity, and inclusion report from 2021, which is called Zero Barriers, reports on efforts it has made to increase diversity in its clinical trials. And that's the quote at the bottom of this slide. In one pilot clinical study, we've seen a 14% increase in ethnic and racial minority subjects. And at another site that historically recruited an average of 8% Black patients for clinical trials, increased its enrollment of Black patients to 43%. And so I thought that it was interesting that they are making those connections. And then we also have the Environmental, Social, and Governance report from BMS from 2020, where they talked about one of the things that one of their objectives, the objective of BMS Diversity in Clinical Trials program, is to improve recruitment of diverse patients. In line with our 2020 commitments, our ambition is to locate 25% of U.S. clinical trial sites in highly diverse communities by 2022. So that was a significant statement and a significant commitment. And then along the lines of transparency, you know, picking up what Kyle said about PhRMA, saying that not only should companies be developing policies around clinical trial diversity, but that they should be making those policies public. Pfizer made a very public commitment and published its own version of Snapshots, essentially, the demographic diversity of participants in its sponsored clinical trials in the US from 2011 to 2020, and said that they were doing so because they wanted to publicly benchmark where they were so that they could repeat that and see how they were doing in the future. And finally, I think another interesting aspect of this is that you can see from AdvaMed and PhRMA that there are cross-industry collaborations going on to set up clinical trial sites, to collaborate with HBCUs to devote clinical trial efforts and improve recommendations across the industry, which is really interesting. And I've heard from people in industry that they think that this is interesting because this is a place where they can collaborate and work on efforts largely without antitrust implications, and do some good work across the industry. So Kyle's big thought, I think, was very different than mine. Kyle?
Sure. So my thought was that in light of the realities that we are acknowledging here, that in order to achieve the diverse clinical trial populations that we're going for, that we recognize a need for, we might need to do some new things to really move the needle. And in the efforts to figure out what those might be, some people have asked questions about, what about different payment options? So what about paying for more than just travel and lodging? Can you add childcare? Can you add elder care? Can you add hourly wage replacement for time spent actually participating in the trial? And today, currently, we know a few things. So first, the FDA does not consider reimbursement for reasonable travel, which includes airfare, parking, lodging, to raise issues regarding undue influence to get somebody to participate in a trial. Second, the FDA says that it recognizes that payment for participation in a trial raises tough issues that need to be addressed by the IRB. And while the FDA considers payments for participating in trials to be a recruitment incentive rather than a benefit that confers undue influence, IRBs who have to review and approve these payments need to be sensitive to the potential for undue influence. In general, the recruitment payments we've seen are not tied to things like missed hours at work or replacement childcare, but it's possible that we'll see that change in the future. And third, and finally, there's this thorny issue about waivers of co-payments.
So I think that last one that you raised, waiver of co-payments, is really intriguing because I know from work that I've done with you, Kyle, that we typically worry about OIG considering waiver of insurance cost sharing as a potential inducement, getting you in trouble under the kickback laws. Are you suggesting that this could change?
So traditionally, and kind of as a baseline point of view, you're absolutely right that OIG considers waivers of copays and out-of-pocket cost subsidization as higher on the risk spectrum under the anti-kickback statute and the beneficiary inducement civil monetary penalty laws. We're starting to see a little bit of a change there and have been actually for some time, but most recently in the last year, OIG has issued 2 advisory opinions where they found with respect to clinical trials that they would not pose administrative sanctions against the entities that were subsidizing out-of-pocket expenses, including cost-sharing obligations for clinical study participants. And the more recent advisory opinion of the 2 that came out earlier this year specifically cited the sponsor's goal of increasing diversity among study populations as a factor that it took into consideration. Now, I think the important thing to keep in mind with the OIG advisory opinions are they are limited to the specific situation and to the party at issue that requested the opinion. So unless you're doing the exact same thing and have the same fact pattern, you can't necessarily rely on it, but it is instructive to others in the industry of ways to move forward on this. The other important thing to note is that these advisory opinions both concern device trials, which is significant first because in those cases, as in many device trials, CMS reviewed the trial protocol and approved coverage of devices beforehand, which let CMS kind of go through the process of determining that adequate patient protections were in place in those studies and that those studies would satisfy important patient treatment goals. which they considered as a mitigating factor and important in determining that there was a low risk of fraud and abuse. And the second reason why it's important that these were device trials is that the types of seeding arrangements that OIG has taken issue with in the pharma world, where if you induce patients to begin taking a chronic medication that they could continue taking in the future, that's more of a risk than, for example, a one-time use device that's being subsidized in one instance. That being said, whether we're talking drugs or devices, it's interesting that OIG has specifically called out the goal of seeking diverse clinical trial populations and has weighed that as a factor here. And it's something that we might expect to see increase in the future as FDA really tries to ramp up its efforts to have diverse clinical study populations.
Well, I think that was a much bigger thought than mine, but thank you for that. I think we can now open the floor for questions.
Thank you. We do have a few questions from our listener. Our first one, is there concern that the emphasis on diversity in clinical trials could lead companies to compromise other important factors?
So I think I'm going to come back on video. I think that's a good question. And I think you have to think about it a couple of different ways. I mean, one way is what FDA's guidance and interest is will certainly require companies to rethink conventional wisdom. So if, for example, we had certain exclusion criteria in clinical trials that we've become comfortable with, this will require us to rethink our exclusion criteria for the reasons that Kyle explained so well. If we have to invest in creating or working with people to create new clinical trial sites where they previously did not exist, that is going to be, in some ways, a quote unquote burden on the system. But the way I think about it is you have to turn it around to say that a clinical trial, the goal of a clinical trial is to figure out the safety and effectiveness of a product. It does not do us well in the long run if we're devising products and measuring them in the wrong quote unquote population. That is a population that is not necessarily as highly burdened with a disease, or a population that, or we're actually potentially doing harm because we're taking limited dollars out of the system and treating people with medications that are not effective, where we could have developed combination drugs like in the blood pressure situation that we were talking about before, or developing better things that really do address the real issue. Kyle, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I think the one thing I would add is that the need for diverse clinical trial populations and a focus on ways of doing that is born out of actual need. And we've seen it in the examples that we talked about today, where it had real world consequences and a real effect on people who were taking medications or using drugs after they were approved, that, you know, could have been better known or prevented had we been making a greater effort and a smarter effort at increasing the diversity in clinical trial populations. And I think it's important not just for the sake of the patient, and it's absolutely important for the sake of the patients, but it's important to keep in mind as a sponsor of a trial and as a manufacturer of a drug or device, because it allows you to identify and address risks on the front end instead of being subject to product liability litigation or securities shareholders litigation in the future, because there was something that you missed that you should have been able to or could have been able to address beforehand.
And I guess the last piece that I would add is that it's not just avoiding risk, it's also increasing the potential patient pool, because if we properly focus on where the disease burden is, and if we pull underrepresented populations into the clinical trial pool, then we can perhaps label things more appropriately for those populations, or also reach people who we have not reached for many of the same reasons that we haven't reached them in clinical trials. So the examples of the underuse of TAVR in minority populations, if we are increasing the clinical trial presence of underrepresented populations, we might also bring more of our products to patients, which can be of benefit as well. Zuhal, do we have any other questions?
Yes, second question. So Kyle, you have just spoken about things that are happening in terms of really novel potential changes to what you are allowed to pay for. So typically in clinical trials, there are prohibitions in place as to what you as a sponsor can pay for. Do you really think that there will be significant changes to what companies are permitted to pay for in clinical trials to increase diversity?
So a couple of things. First of all, I think there's two parts of that question. There's, what is actually going to be covered and the impact that has on, government payers and their involvement, and that that's going to take an actual new policy statement. And I don't know one way or another whether we can expect to see anything there. But on the fraud and abuse side, and on the risks related to providing remuneration, something of value to patients in exchange for their participation in a trial, I think what we've seen from OIG over the last 20, 30 years is that they do a balancing act and they take into account all of the relevant factors. And I think from what we've seen in these recent advisory opinions is that the goal of increasing diversity in clinical trials is one factor that they will consider. And they will look at the total picture and see, what the actual risk of fraud and abuse is in a given situation. So the examples that we gave earlier, because they were device trials and CMS had granted coverage for the devices, and in doing so had reviewed the trials and were confident in what the trials were attempting to accomplish, that as a total package made the risk here lower, and OIG decided not to take action. And what we'll see in the future is that the goal of increasing diversity will be one factor among many that OIG will consider in the process.
Thank you. And I think those are all the questions that we have. Thank you very much, Ronni and Kyle, for your time today. And I know that your presentation will be very valuable to our audience.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.